Poverty has increased, people are suffering. Growth needs to come to Argentina.
If people not only get, let's say, stability on prices, but also if they see that there is a real chance of Argentina getting on track again, that will give Milei more time to implement this harsh adjustment. If not, he will enter, let's say, in more turbulent waters.
He took over an economy he himself described as teetering on the edge of a precipice, one characterized by triple-digit inflation and overwhelming deficit and widespread poverty. Now, almost 1 year on, Argentine President Javier Milei credits himself with restoring order. But how do things look on the ground? To find out, I'm joined today by two guests. Ramiro Tosi formerly held the position of Undersecretary of Finance in Argentina, and Alicia Garcia-Herrero is an international economist at Natixis and a close watcher of Latin American economies. Welcome to you both. Ramiro, maybe I can begin with you. It's been almost a year now since Milei took over. Does ordinary life in Argentina look or feel any different?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. Yes, as you mentioned in the introduction, let's say one of the main achievements of the Milei administration has been bringing down inflation dramatically. Remember that last year, the inflation stood at nearly 212%, and now, according to the latest estimates, the inflation rate on a monthly basis is below 3%, and it will finish the year in a level that still is very high, 120%, but on an everyday basis, people are starting to feel, let's say, more comfortable for this stability that hasn't been achieved for a long time.
Okay, so let's see how he did that. He promised to cut down dramatically on government spending. Alicia, did he do that? Did he follow through on that promise?
Absolutely. Well, actually, we're basically at a surplus, but that's how you reduce inflation. The problem is that that's also how you reduce growth, and Argentina is in a recession. So he did what he promised, but the unintended consequences of reducing inflation with what we would call a cold turkey, the kind of stabilization program that Milei has introduced, meaning all of a sudden, massive reduction in government expenditure. We all know that it has growth consequences. Now, the question is, will the economies recover quickly after this stabilization? And that is indeed what we need to know next.
I do want to look a bit more closely at those policies he's been following, because two of them, devaluing the peso and cutting subsidies, actually do make things more expensive in the short term. Alicia, do you believe Milei is on track now to solve the inflation problem? And if we're still at over 100% on an annual basis, how do you define success in this context?
Well, I think his main risk comes from the exchange rate, because actually the peso has appreciated, and this is very logical because of the still high inflation. So especially in real terms, the currency is very, very, very appreciated, and Argentina still has very, very strict capital controls. Otherwise, probably the peso would drop. And the question is, Milei has promised that he would start lifting these controls, I think, early next year. Will he manage to do that without creating a slide on the peso? And if that happens, of course, that's very inflationary. So there is a risk to this inflation path, in my view.
Let's talk about debt, because Argentina has traditionally financed its enormous spending by taking on huge quantities of debt, especially from the International Monetary Fund. Now, Ramiro, in your previous role, you actually took part in some talks with the IMF. What kind of reception did government officials get when they went to New York for these kinds of discussions?
Well, as Alicia mentioned, this is one of the, let's say, weak parts of the program, the external, let's say, component of the program. Argentina, as you mentioned, has been heavily indebted since 2016, when Argentina returned to the capital markets and then eventually lost the market access in 2018. And that led the previous administration to go to an IMF program that we had to renegotiate in 2022. And now the new administration is trying to move forward with a new agreement with IMF with, let's say, the so-declared intention of removing capital controls and bolster, let's say, the level of international reserves, because nowadays Argentina has a deficit in the international reserves of the central bank. So that's why the government needs, let's say, more robust central bank reserves in order to think about removing the capital control. So the perception among investors is that this is, let's say, a prerequisite for normalizing the relationship with, let's say, the investor base. The problem being is what type of lifting of these controls in Argentina will take in place, because the last experience wasn't good at all, and the IMF also learned from that experience. So that's, let's say, the big question to be discussed here in Argentina, and also with the government and the IMF officials.
I want to look a little bit at exports now. It's often been a huge source of underperformance in Argentina. Ramiro, Milei promised to scrap export taxes, but if I understand right, he hasn't followed through on this yet. Why is he dragging his heels?
Well, because, let's say, the taxes on export is a big component of the fiscal revenue. So removing this type of taxes will create a big, let's say, fiscal problem for the government. And that's why, although he promised to gradually removing the taxes and duties on import and export, he only managed, let's say, to decrease some taxes for the import side, the so-called impuesto país, that in fact is, let's say, being finishing next month. But remember that Argentina needs desperately dollars. So that's why almost until October, latest figures, Argentina got a surplus of nearly $16 billion, primarily because of the good performance of the agricultural sector after the severe drought that was hitting last year, and also an important recovery from the energy sector, because most of the infrastructure projects were in place this year, so that allowed most of the companies exploring oil and gas to evacuate the production, and that's why we are having, after nearly 15 years, a surplus in the energy, let's say, trade balance.
Okay, so he still needs that revenue quite desperately right now. I'm also curious about how Milei is handling economic relationships. Alicia, what, broadly speaking, is his strategy on trade?
Good question. I mean, Milei is a liberal, so we should see him behaving accordingly. But when you actually look at Milei's role internationally, he's not really a major proponent of, multilateralism. He's not really like taking that torch, which many would expect him to do compared to other leaders in the region. So it's a good question, really. I think one thing that I think he really wanted when he started, and the question is he going to manage, is really to move Argentina up the ladder. So with every discussion with China, which is basically a very large importer of Argentina's natural resources, there's always this idea that we want to do more. But the reality is that the economy is still too unstable to do that. I mean, it's very hard for anybody to set up a greenfield investment given the macro picture of Argentina. So I guess the idea is for Argentina to play more of a role in the global supply chain and have a trade strategy that is not only commodity driven. The economy has to be stable. And this is the old Argentina, where auto parts were very important in its export composition. But for that, you need stability. Inflation can't be dominating the scene, nor can it a recession, if you think about it, because there's very little you can do with such economy. So I guess it's all related. More time is needed for a trade strategy to really appear in the country.
That's really interesting. You mentioned China. Milei met Xi Jinping at the G20 summit recently. Ramiro, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the kind of relationship these two leaders have.
Well, that's interesting because, as Alicia mentioned, Argentina has strong linkages with China, let's say, in two important areas. One is the trade side. As Alicia mentioned, Argentina has a lot of exports going to China, and also is a big importer of manufacturing goods produced in China. But at the same time, remember that Argentina signed a swap agreement with the Popular Bank of China, And one of the first measures of Milei and part of his cabinet was, in fact, to renegotiate this agreement. This was essential for the performance of the central bank reserve. That's why, besides, let's say, the strong messages in the campaign and during the first, months of administration, he was very pragmatic because he knew that this country has a vital role in the Argentina economy. So he tried to manage, let's say, the promises of the campaign, but at the same time being pragmatic because he knows that Argentina will need China, let's say, for a long time.
That's interesting. And I've heard that said a lot, that he has turned out to be a lot more pragmatic and a little bit less radical than expected. Now, personal relationships, of course, play a big role here as well. And we have seen Milei cozy up to both Elon Musk and Donald Trump, with whom he seems to have an affinity. Alicia, how do you see Argentina's relationship with the United States developing in the next few years?
Well, I mean, this is a good question. It would look as if it's going to be a nice ride if you compare, Lula or any other, kind of more leftist leaders, or even Mexico. I think Argentina has a chance to have a privileged relation with the U.S. But again, this brings us back to China. Unfortunately, I mean, Argentina is so dependent on China that its position between the two hegemons might be difficult to play. I guess that at the end of the day, the swap line is around $5 billion US. I mean, IMF is over 40 billion. So clearly, I mean, the dependence is mostly not so much financial, but I think trade-wise. For that, the U.S. has very little to offer. There's not going to be any free trade agreement, any, major change in the trade relations. So in that regard, I think Milei will have to still play those two balls, without letting any of the two fall on the floor.
And that brings us back to that pragmatism, doesn't it? We do know that Musk has expressed interest in developing lithium mining in Argentina. Ramiro, where else do you see big potential when it comes to foreign investment?
Well, as you mentioned, Argentina has, a great competitive advantage in some of these sectors that, in fact, hasn't been, fully researched yet. So we are, still developing the biggest shale oil and gas camps in the south of Patagonia. And also there are a lot of mining projects along, Argentina, in Mendoza, Catamarca, etc., with international companies very interested in getting not only the lithium, but also other critical minerals, like, for example, the copper, that is very important in Chile, but in Argentina hasn't been fully developed yet. So I think that would be, the most favored sectors in the coming years, because these sectors has a lot of potential to increase the capacity of exportation of Argentina very quickly. And that's what the country needs at the end of the day.
I have a final question for you both. Given that Argentina's problems go back so many decades, they cannot all be tackled in a single term. Do you think the people of Argentina are willing to continue with this kind of Mileionomics in the long term? Alicia, what do you think?
Well, Milei is popular, if anything, because of the inflation developments. But this could turn because, the poverty has increased. I mean, there's a lot of scarring, a huge scarring of this massive reduction in the fiscal deficit. The success has to continue. What has happened is positive, but it's not enough, I think, for re-election, because people are suffering. Growth needs to come to Argentina.
Ramiro, how much pain do you think the people of Argentina are willing to put up with?
Well, that's the most relevant question, because if you see at the numbers in this year, most of the, for example, public workers and also some of the private workers had suffered an adjustment in the real wages of almost 20%, and also, the other part of the market has also suffered similar figures. So I think that at the end of the day, the social tolerance will come, as Alicia mentioned, with growth. If people not only get, let's say, stability on prices, but also if they see that there is a real chance of Argentina getting on track again, that will give Milei more time to implement this harsh adjustment. If not, he will enter, let's say, in more turbulent waters.
Okay, so Argentina needs growth fast. Ramiro Tosi and Alicia Garcia-Herrero, thank you both so much for talking to me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.